Good. See, that's commitment. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks
Oh,
for having me.
awesome. Perfect. So, without further talking, because I think I've done enough. Okay, everybody's ready. Perfect. I think it's beautiful. Oh, beautiful. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, sweet. Let's go.
Thank you. Hey everyone, that's quite a large user group. I like that. What I want to talk to you guys about today is something that I've seen and that we've seen in our team and I've seen with many other teams that has changed over the last years, I want to say, and also how we work, is that for us, and I mean that's a little bit polemic, but servers are dead. And we are all using services now, and the services are the new main building blocks for most of the stuff that we build. Just as a quick introduction, so I'm with CodeShip. We do continuous delivery as a hosted service. So we test your code, we deploy your code. More importantly, this is CodeShip. This was from our sailing trip last August, although we are now twice as many people, so that is a little bit out of date, but just to get some context. We talk to a lot of people, or I talk to a lot of people about how they build, how they test, and how they deploy their software. So that's where I got some of those ideas from. I hope you like some of them, and I hope you give me pushback on some of the others. But yeah, to go to the content. We're now at a state where everything moves so quickly that we're under constant pressure by our competitors, by markets, with coming up with new features. Our customers constantly want new stuff. If we don't deliver or fix features quickly enough, they leave and go to competitors. And even our teams, our process, and the technology itself changes so quickly all the time that it's really, really hard to even just keep up with it. So at this point, it's really software is eating everything. I mean, there's the software is eating the world thing, but we're at a point where software is eating your own products. If you're not quick enough, there's another competitor coming up that will just eat your lunch and kill your company. So it's all about go fast or go home. You really need to get as much productivity out of every day, out of every person in your team, out of your infrastructure, to be able to move as quickly as possible to build the products today. Because otherwise, I mean, there is literally no industry that doesn't get, I mean, the word is kind of strange still, but disrupted by software. Be it Uber, like the taxi industry probably thought they had a very cushy job until Uber came along. And taxi is pretty old, like transportation and bringing people from place to place is a pretty old business, and they've totally got it from the sidelines from Uber. So there's really no place where you don't need to move fast. And over the last couple of years, we've seen a large revolution, I think, in how we build software. That's specifically the cloud, giving us the ability to scale to any number of instances, to have a lot of flexibility in how we want to build, and to really start with going with that more microservices approach. And the real revolution of all of this is not so much in how we build that stuff, because it was possible to do virtualization, to run with your own VMware cluster in the past, but like which small team would run their own VMware cluster or would run their own like huge infrastructure? That's just a lot of work. So I think the real revolution that happened over the last couple of years is the accessibility. Teams like Instagram with, I think at the last time they were like 12 people before they were bought, or like probably most teams here that go with any kind of cloud service build huge applications and huge infrastructure and support a lot of customers and a lot of users with very small teams, very small overhead. So being able to have that accessibility to build any kind of complex infrastructure and to scale it to any kind of system and system size and customer size is really the core of that revolution. Not so much in like, there's been service-driven architecture or microservices or however you want to call it in the past, but small teams weren't able to do that. It's just way too much work in the past. But that changed now because we don't have to deal with everything all the time anymore. So now that we have that revolution, and that revolution really has taken place with Amazon being like a multi-billion, so AWS being a multi-billion dollar company in and of itself, and DigitalOcean and all the others that are out there. Another step is now happening that, in my opinion, and I'd like to know your opinion on that as well later on, is we're now starting to see a service evolution. So where in the past And I mean, this has started to happen over the last couple of years with Heroku abstracting away a lot of the complexities that EC2 itself has. But now we're at a point where, and I guess as Node people, you probably have seen the latest release from AWS, Lambda, that literally just lets you write a single function, JavaScript function or Node function, and that's it. And you just push that code or you edit the code in the browser, and it runs it on any kind of events. And that just takes away a lot of complexity from building really microservices architectures and really makes microservices the new norm. So while in the past, building a lot of services, building a lot of small services, and I've talked to teams who have, some of them have hundreds of services in production, is an insane amount of work. Like really splitting up your application in very small parts, managing them independently, making sure you have the same infrastructure running them on independently is just really, really, really a hard problem to solve. I'd like to know, like, who in the audience, like, who of you guys use a microservices approach to your application? Like with hand signs? Like, who runs more than 10 services? Who runs more than 20? Okay, 30? How big is your team? 60 people. How big is your team? So not huge teams, but much larger than the typical like 5-10 people startup in the beginning. So it just takes a lot of people to build all of that. And AWS or on your own infrastructure? Pardon? Okay. Yeah, so that's something that on your own service. Interesting. I'd like to talk to you later on because that sounds really interesting and really hard. But so I think that, but that's something that with this approach, like most hands should go up in the future. Like for any kind of more in my opinion, of course. Please, everything I state here is obviously prefaced with, in my opinion. So that, because microservices have a lot of advantages, they have some disadvantages with really having to maintain a lot of different applications and making sure all of them work well, having monitoring in place, having error detection in place, all of that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, they really make it possible to split your work in very small parts, test it separately, deploy it separately. And I think that's something that certainly we strive for in our infrastructure, and we're definitely pushing more for. But I think one of the biggest hurdles in the past was making sure it works, making sure you have the right tools in place for everything. And with tools like, or services like Lambda now, this just changes everything, in my opinion. Because one of the big hurdles is now that we're starting to see the communication between those microservices getting abstracted away as well. Like Lambda, you don't have to think about like how do I plug in SQS or anything like that anymore. There's just somewhere an event is happening in your system, you store something in the database, and somewhere else some code is executed on top of that. Of course, you need to keep that overview, and you need to understand why this is happening in the later stage, but it's happening without you having to do anything around that, and not having to manage that kind of infrastructure, and not having to worry about that anymore, and having to worry about keeping that up, having to worry about any kind of backend queuing service anymore, is really liberating. So you can finally focus even more on just your business logic and not have to deal with anything else. And something that is really important for us, and I guess for most teams here, is then you're much closer to you build it, you run it, because developers really only have to focus about their code and not really about the infrastructure anymore, because that's now somebody else's problem that I can buy, and not just somebody else's problem, but somebody else who has a lot more resources, can put a lot more engineering into that, and just build that same product for a lot more people. And in our team, we really, like, if somebody builds something, they're responsible for running that. We don't really want to have ops teams in our team, because it would set the wrong incentives. And I totally understand the reasons why other teams do it, but we decided in our team we won't do that. So that really, either you have then the full stack people who really can do everything, but then a lot of time is often wasted when they have to debug things that really they shouldn't have to. And we want people to be as close to the code and as close to the product and what actually drives our business as possible. So having services, having Heroku, having AWS Lambda, and now the new things that are coming up is really helpful and important. And at least what we've seen and what I've seen in talks with many people is that when the complexity of your infrastructure grows and the level of control and you start with a more microservices-based architecture, over time, not all of those services need to be in a system where you have more control. For example, you can start with something that runs on Lambda or with something that runs on Heroku. And if you have many of those services, some of them might have more scale or you need more control over. So you move them over to AWS or other systems, but not all of them. And I think that trying to push all of these, like trying to have an either or approach of like pushing all of them into services infrastructure for the longer term, or because you can't run some of them on there, moving off is a tough choice to make in the beginning. But it's, so you guys have done that mixed approach for a while now. Pardon? Okay, from your own hardware infrastructure. Yeah, and I think that definitely something that makes sense to not have to deal with those underlying things. But then on top of that, AWS, but many other providers have so many services on there that you really can take a lot of advantages from. And starting with standardized components, starting with standardized languages really helps there a lot. Of course, a big issue there is lock-in. Like AWS Lambda is awesome. On the other hand, you're kind of a little bit locked into them. So I see like 3 different scenarios for lock-in. With this kind of infrastructure and this kind of process in place. The first is simply inertia, code lock-in and architecture lock-in. So inertia, like it just takes a while to move stuff, especially data. That's, I mean, running an application on Heroku, AWS, or somewhere else is probably not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is how do I move my data off. So making sure from the beginning with different services, with making sure you replicate to other services, that data can be moved off easily is something that helped us at least to a degree to be able to move those services, take service that we have in a more, in a higher level service and then move off to AWS and or others in the future if we need to. The second is, I think, for example, is anybody here using Google App Engine or has used Google App Engine for like production like infrastructure in the past? Or so more than just like playing with it and seeing that it just is painful? Okay, couple. Is it a good experience still, or? No. Okay. So something that and I think that's one of the biggest problems of App Engine is that you write it for App Engine and then it works exactly on App Engine, and not even really in a like it kind of works in the development environment, but yeah, kind of. And I think that's where they really lost most users. Because code level lock-in is something that we really, really, really don't want to have on a specific platform, or as little as possible. Because that forces you to stay with that specific provider more than anything else, if you're very, very much tied into that specific provider. I think Amazon, and for that matter Heroku, are doing a much better job in that, where you can try to not be locked in on a very deep code level. But on the other hand, what it leads to, like that microservices architecture, is an architecture login. If you use a lot of AWS Lambda, if you use a lot of small services, moving that kind of infrastructure, for example, onto your own hardware or to some other provider is really, really tough if they don't provide the same level of services. So while, of course, I mean, you can build a simple background worker system that replicates AWS Lambda and then run it on your own system, but that's going to be a tough job. And same with so many other things that AWS provides. So I think that the architecture login is something that we definitely have to find a solution for. I think that's why we need to have a lot more tools and processes around how to build microservices, how to build a microservice architecture, to be able to run them on different providers. And with Docker and Doku and all those services out there, there's very interesting approaches how we can do that in the future. But yeah, that's still there, and that's even going to be more and more in the future when we build this kind of very small, very focused on a specific piece of business function, kind of software things. And following on that, I think the complexity in that now moves from running, maintaining, scaling, building like these monoliths, which are painful longer term to handle when the tests get slow and there's a lot of stuff that we have to manage, in really keeping a good overview over all the existing applications, making sure all of them are maintained fine, all the dependencies are at the latest versions, all that kind of stuff. And for that, and that's more of a call that I've been like telling more and more people and hoping more and more people come up with cool stuff. We need better workflows, better tools and better processes to generally deal with a microservices architecture. I think that a lot of larger teams, a lot of the Netflix of the world can deal with that. A lot of the like 10, 15, 20, 30 people teams, the workflows, tools and processes are not yet in place to make that easy, to make it easy to really start with a microservices architecture from the beginning. I think a lot of the services need to be there. I think we should embrace those services, but on the other hand, we also need to come up with new tools and need to really start thinking through how we as small, medium-sized teams can start building those kinds of infrastructures and how we can make that easy in the future. Yeah, thanks. That was my very rough thoughts about like why servers, I think, aren't the main building blocks anymore, and we really should start going for the services. I'm happy to take questions or discussion points. One quick thing, I brought a bunch of shirts, and I think, are they out there? Or yeah, they're out there. Yes, so we have male and female cuts all over there. Yeah, but happy to take questions or if you have any discussion points also later on via beer. Thanks.